Goldstein.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. And to pick up where the last speaker spoke, there will be no policing of bedrooms under my watch. I rise as a proud, long-term and committed supporter of marriage for same-sex couples, not the Johnny-come-latelys on the other side of the chamber, and I support this bill to enable it to happen. As the member for Brisbane said recently in this place, we will both enjoy an unblemished history in voting for pathways for change. If only the Senate opposition leader or the member for Sydney could say the same thing. To be frank, Mr Deputy Speaker, listening to those in the opposition who parade around with a false piety on this issue is becoming tiresome. Mr Deputy Speaker, I am not going to try and pretend this debate about a plebiscite has been easy, because it hasn't been. It is rare in this place that you debate something so intimate and personal as your own relationship, and let alone consider putting it up for a public vote. Many people have written to me and said, in light of my personal circumstances, why would I vote for the plebiscite? And the answer is simple. Because I am the federal Liberal member for Goldstein. I have a responsibility to discharge my duties to the people of my electorate and my party, not just myself. Many Goldstein residents came up to me during the election and asked my view on the matter. And my answer has been consistent, that the coalition would hold a plebiscite and I would vote for change so long as there was a sensible respect for religious liberty. And when the issue arises at the appropriate time, I will act consistent with my commitment because, to quote the former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, the last thing you should do is dud the people who voted for you. And it's true that I've always said that a plebiscite is not my first preference to change this law. Plebiscites may not be preferable, but it is not as though they are an illegitimate tool. Many have been used around the world on this issue to resolve it. Of course, Ireland did require it by constitution, and it's true that the debate was at times offensive. There were people who supported the change who disrespected people's worldview and faith on the purpose of marriage. Similarly, there were people who opposed change, who dismissed the value of same-sex couples and their families. And no one would voluntarily go through that experience again. But if people were asked whether they'd go through it again for the outcome, then the answer would almost assuredly be yes, because the outcome is worth fighting for. The overwhelming yes vote in Ireland was a moment of national unity, and it disappoints me that our country is being robbed of that moment of national unity by the opposition. Those opposed change had to accept the outcome, unless they wanted to renounce support for democracy. And it became a watershed moment. Debate about equality before the law was over, permanently. The plebiscite will call on Australians to show mutual respect. That can be achieved. I have great faith in the Australian people to argue this issue respectfully and to stand up against those who don't. Offensive conduct is the exception. It is not the rule. I'm proud to say that despite the personal nature of the debate, at all times I have sought to be as respectful as possible in this discussion, and particularly to those I disagree with. More importantly, I'm proud to be a member of a party and a government with so many people who have engaged in this debate with incredible respect. The Prime Minister has set an exceptional example, as, might I add, has the member for Canning, and I commend both of them for their contributions. And I have no doubt others will follow in their footsteps. I don't believe the case for change can win in Australia. I believe it will win in Australia. Convincing Australians for a change in the law is the fulfilment of our values as a nation. Arguing for that is a winning strategy. And that is why the opposition leaders' divisive approach is so appalling. Parliamentarians should always be mindful that their words have a special influence in setting the tone of public debates. The opposition leader's demeanour is truly extraordinary. Australians are apparently capable of deliberations to elect him to the highest political office in this country, but not to discuss one of his policies. There are legitimate critiques of the plebiscite, not least of which is the Western liberal democracy tradition that Parliament is charged with the primary role of protecting people's rights. But it is blindingly obvious that Labor's approach is not driven by some sort of philosophical principle, but purely one of politics. People are being put second. While Aboriginal Australians are desperately fighting to get on the ballot paper, they're trying to con LGBTI Australians to get off it. The opposition leader has used the debate around the plebiscite to call anyone who he disagreed with as promoting homophobia, bigotry and hate speech. It does nothing to bring the Australian community together for a respectful debate. It is also deeply irresponsible and inaccurate. There are around a third of Australians who have a different view from the position that I take, based in things such as tradition or faith. That's nearly the same number who strangely give Labor their primary vote, and yet we somehow manage to let them govern the country from time to time. Disrespecting them does nothing to advance the case for change. Perhaps the opposition leader's worst contribution is to say that we cannot win a plebiscite. In doing so, he shows a lack of faith in the cause and also in himself. You cannot have it both ways. Arguing that a plebiscite is unnecessary because public opinion polls show Australians support a change, and yet concurrently suggesting the plebiscite will lose, is an embarrassing logical fallacy. For years, advocates have argued marriage equality should be supported because the majority of Australians support it. Over 6 years of the last Labor government, politicians couldn't pass this change. In this parliament, there is a pathway forward. No party has enough MPs or senators to get a bill passed through either house. The plebiscite represents a workable solution to an issue that doesn't deserve to be delayed any longer. Sitting back and waiting is not cost-free. People do say hurtful things. We acknowledge that. They have before, they will now, and they will again in the future. And none of that will change based on whether we have a plebiscite or not, and even after there is a change in the law. The absurdity of the opposition leader's approach is that he argues publicly debating the issue through will be tough. And yes, in part he is right. But if that's the reason enough, then we should never have advocated change in the first place, because the price will always be too high. I guess that's the cowardice when your sole interest in debate is political and not principle. Implicit in the opposition leader's comments are that LGBTI Australians are weak. And let me make this crystal clear, Mr Deputy Speaker. We are not victims, and I take exception to him implying otherwise, implying we are. Worse, the opposition leader and his shadow Attorney-General have validated the idea that those who seek change should just sit back and wait. It's not the right of others who have never had to wait to decide for those who have. My good friend Paul Ritchie got me to reflect on this point deeper when he recently sent me a section of Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail dated the 16th of April 1963. While some of the language is stronger than I'd apply in this situation, the sentiment is appropriate. King Jr. said, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was, quote, well-timed, in the view of those who have not suffered unduly. That is why now is our time. We must seize it, and this is worth fighting for." Choosing the false comfort to wait for change rather than fight for it is deeply irresponsible. That isn't what those have done before us who have fought for change to make a more just world, a more just community, and importantly, a more just Australia. In that time, couples will have partners that die and will never be able to experience the full legal recognition of their relationship. Such an attitude comes from the hubris of thinking change is inevitable. Change is never inevitable, and attitudes change. Sadly, Labor have succeeded in conning people into thinking that they can just sit back and wait. Labor aren't saying it because they think it will deliver a better outcome. They're saying it for deeply selfish reasons. For 6 years, they failed to change the law, as people like me who advocated for it had to sit through it, while we watched Kevin Rudd oppose change because it offended his culture and religion. Then Julia Gillard, who opposed it on cultural grounds. And then we had Kevin Rudd, who came back, changed his mind and did nothing. Then as soon as they were in opposition, Labor said we've all waited too long. As my grandmother would say, quite rightly, what cheek. If Labor only finds their social conscience in opposition, I say, keep you there. We have waited long enough. Speaker, the only reason Labor don't want a plebiscite is because they want to change the law one day. in the far-off future when they are in government, and I'm hoping it's a long time in the future. It's not about people who want to get married, it's about them and their selfishness. Deep down, Labor don't want to change under a Liberal government and a coalition government because they know it is a thoroughly Liberal reform. It embodies the cultural and institutional conservatism of forward-looking liberalism by recognising the primacy and importance of marriage and seeking to ensure its enduring relevance for the 21st century. And it appeals to our belief that government should not dictate the terms of people's lives if they do no harm to others. It also appeals to one of the most basest Liberal principles, that all people are equal before the law and should enjoy the equal protection of the law. Australians who advocate for change are arguing for inclusiveness and society built on responsibility and mutual respect. And when the law changes, it will be a great day for our country. We will be a more perfect Commonwealth, where everyone has an equal investment in Australian society. Speaker, many people have raised the concern about the anxiety that a plebiscite might cause, and I note that it's come up periodically in the speeches by those on the opposition benches, and especially amongst young people. Somebody who contacted me went so far as to ask me what my younger self would feel watching his life being debated across the airwaves. Well, I can tell you a couple of things, Mr Deputy Speaker. A younger me probably wouldn't imagine that he'd be standing here. Secondly, that he would have a number of colleagues who would be in similar circumstances standing up for a change in the law. Or that he would have turned recently to the member for North Sydney a few weeks ago and asked, genuinely, did you ever imagine you'd watch the Prime Minister and opposition leader fight over who was more in favour of marriage for same-sex couples on the floor of the House of Representatives? Because, Mr Deputy Speaker, I remember the time that I was coming to terms with my own sexuality in my teenage years, and I spoke about it proudly in my first speech. I wrote recently a column for the Sydney Morning Herald that the announcement of the plebiscite was emotional for me. And it was true, it was. It took me back to that place when I was coming to terms with my sexuality, and the silence and isolation that made me doubt my legitimate place in this world. And I know many people in Australia have relived that pain, but in doing so we have lost sight of where it comes from. Yes, there were negative comments in those years, and bullying came from others. But to be frank, I don't really remember those things or what others said, because in practice they're just background noise. And that is part of the resilience, tragic as it may be, of people growing up and learning how to deal with the world around them. It actually makes them often stronger. And in my case, I knew those comments were wrong. And this is where I think my members of the opposition perhaps don't have a full appreciation of what that experience is like. Because the worst bullying never came from others, but it came from within. The opposition leader clearly doesn't understand that experience. Young LGBTI Australians have no one to turn to for support. The people they fear talking to most are those they traditionally turn to for support: parents, siblings and friends, because those are the people you fear rejection from. And it is this silence that feeds anxiety and doubt. Left alone, isolated, and often trapped and locked in a dungeon of negative thoughts that swirl within your own mind, alone and with no one to talk to or relate to. And that is what the opposition has got wrong, because a plebiscite is not a call to silence. It is an opportunity. It is a call for all of us to stand up for the type of country we want to be, always ready for that fight. The opposition sees defeat. That is why they have chosen silence. Thank you.
I thank the honourable member.